Politicians are used to having insults hurled at them, but what about protests that go further? Is it legitimate to throw eggs, paint, flour, or even a milkshake at a person because you don't like their views? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello there, I'm Shuli Ghosh. Welcome to the programme. The race to become leader of the UK's ruling party is underway, and the candidates might be on alert about a very messy form of protest. It was seen more than once during last month's European election campaign and started a debate about where we should all draw the line on political dissent.
The leader of the UK's Brexit party, Nigel Farage, covered in milkshake. Farage has been accused of racist politics and fueling xenophobia and was one of a number of politicians targeted this way during campaigning for last month's European parliamentary elections. Others included far-right candidate Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, who's a former leader of the extremist English Defence League, and UKIP candidate Carl Benjamin, who's currently being investigated by police over repeatedly threatening to rape a political opponent. Videos of the attacks went viral. The hashtags Splash the Fash and Lactose Against Intolerance were adopted on social media. But others expressed concern that a stunt like this is actually an arrestable offence that should not be part of democratic debate. But before milkshaking became a verb, throwing food items at politicians was already a well-established practice in the UK. And the list of political figures egged, pied, floured or tomatoed is not short. So are these acts of political protest actually violent or merely symbolic political theatre?
Well, let's introduce our guests today. Here at the Roundtable, we have Alex Krasodomski, Director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, a think tank in London. Sharon Dhaliwal, founder and editor of Burnt Roti magazine. Alexander Blanchard, researcher on political violence at Queen Mary University of London. And joining us from Kent in the UK is Frank Furedi, a sociologist and the author of How Fear Works. Welcome to all of you. So, are we seeing more of these kind of protests? And if so, why? Frank, let me start with you.
I think there is a very powerful exclusionary tendency in politics where society has become very segregated and segmented, and people are simply refusing to hear the other side. A very ghettoized environment. And I think as a result of that, a lot of people feel it's legitimate to shut people down or alternatively to humiliate people, which is what you're doing when you're throwing eggs or milkshakes. It's a way of distancing yourself from people who you think are morally inferior to you. So it's a very, very kind of debased development in public life, and something that we should be wary of because it's got a very powerful anti-democratic impulse behind it.
A powerful anti-democratic impulse. Alex, do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think society is becoming as segregated as Frank thinks it is. Perhaps it is along economic lines. It seems, though, that a lot of people are throwing these milkshakes because they've heard enough of these other opinions. I think what there has been is a frustration with the media's failure to hold account people like Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson. And so I think people have started using these objects
when you
as a way
say
of
hold
shifting.
to account, what do you mean? Because throwing a milkshake is not a particularly clever way of debating something, is it?
It's not. I think what you can think about is that there are perhaps tactical ends to throwing these things. Whether it's legitimate or not, I don't know. But certainly if we look at what has happened with the sort of discourse around the EU election, it became less about the sort of bile that these people were willing to spew and more about the milkshakes. Whether that's acceptable discourse, I don't know.
Well, let's look at the kind of targets. In the past, UKIP members Tommy Robinson, Carl Benjamin repeatedly drenched in milkshakes while they were campaigning for the European elections. Obviously, they have views which are abhorrent to a lot of people. So is that a legitimate form of protest if it's someone who is particularly spewing, as Alex says, bile?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. I think it's legitimate to do because what you're essentially doing is throwing shame on what they're saying. You're
Don't
saying...
you lose the argument, though, if you chuck a milkshake at someone rather than debate their views?
Well, that's interesting, actually. I don't know whether you should be debating racism or xenophobia, homophobia. I think we should just be saying that that's wrong. I don't think it's up for debate. And I think when you give them a platform to debate it, then you're allowing a negative narrative around all of that, and I think that's wrong. And so what you're essentially doing when you're throwing milkshakes and eggs is you're shaming their ideologies. You're saying that's incorrect.
It's a humiliation.
Yeah.
I know this is something that you've had experience of in the past, and family members have. I've certainly had an egg thrown at me, and it is a very, you know, it's a racial attack. Do you think they're reaping what they sow, then, these politicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was egged, I wasn't egged to be shamed for my ideology. I was egged to be shamed for who I am. So it's completely different there in many ways, because I was egged as a racist attack. But when you're throwing a milkshake or throwing an egg on someone, you're saying what you're saying is incorrect. Like, whatever you're saying shouldn't exist in this society, and there should be shame brought on it. And so, like, you know, back in medieval days when people had, like, rotten vegetables thrown at them, it was to throw shame at them. You know, and it's the same concept.
And these become very powerful images on social media, don't they? That picture of Nigel Farage scuttling back to his bus covered in milkshake.
Yeah, of course. This is obviously not a debate, and we shouldn't look to sort of compare people having a democratic discourse and saying that this is just a poor form of it. It's just something completely different. We are hijacking a spectacle. You know, it's very obvious to people that through social media and through the media, these events, these people who you disagree with are having their moment in the limelight, and this is an opportunity to take that from them.
And I guess with today's media and social media, certainly, these are images that these politicians can't escape from.
Of course.
They're there forever.
This is a spectacle. This is a spectacle. And actually, perhaps the problems that we're seeing, the problems that Frank actually alludes to around a move away from kind of participatory, conversation-based democracy towards the sort of politics of spectacle. And I think, of course, that is not good for democratic discourse, but I wouldn't put them in the same camp.
I think there is a danger of there being a bit of a double standard, because imagine what would happen if one of Nigel Farage's supporters would do something similar to a Labour Party politician or a Tory Party politician. That would be called political violence, and it would be condemned, and the language that would be used would be to criminalize it and to kind of call it fascistic. And it seems to me that there seems to be this double standard, that it's okay for one side to do it, but when another side do it, it has a different kind of moral content.
So, so do you think it crosses the line into political violence then, Frank?
I don't. I think with any performative action like that, it depends on the context. I don't think it's an act of violence, but I think, to me, it's quite illegitimate to somehow say that there are many, many issues that are beyond debate. I don't think that any issue should be beyond debate, because once we go down that road, then it seems to me that we end up just being very selective as to what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed. And I think,
as Alex says, throwing a milkshake is not about having a debate. It's about making someone look ridiculous and humiliated to undermine their platform.
And it's really about closing down discussion, because basically what you're signaling is that these are people beyond the pale. These are people you can humiliate with impunity. These are people that somehow are outside of the border of normal, legitimate public life. And it seems to me that it's no less exclusionary than when somebody promotes racialist ideology or chauvinist ideology. I do think we need to be able to transcend our own point of view. And if you're a genuine Democrat, then you need to see all sides as having the right, even if you violently disagree with them, in participating in discussion and debate. And I do worry when people talk about certain issues as being beyond debate. Somehow we cannot discuss that. It's got no place in our world. Well, we may not like it, but when millions and millions of people have strong views about a particular issue, we cannot simply, like children, wish them away.
Okay, well, let's talk about double standards, because that's a great point that Frank's brought up, that, you know, if we use this as a form of protest for views that we don't agree with, then does that justify you throwing a milkshake on a politician who espouses Brexit and you happen to not believe in Brexit, for example?
No, not necessarily. The argument that Frank makes is one you find that was made quite often when these milkshakes were being thrown. If you're not happy with Nigel Farage having milkshake thrown on him, then you're not going to be happy about, say, Jeremy Corbyn or Anna Soubry.
But what people are saying, it's OK for Nigel Farage to have a milkshake thrown on him, but not Anna Soubry or Jeremy Corbyn.
But at the same time, the argument Frank makes, he says you then have to look at context. Well, let's consider the context. People like Anna Soubry, Jeremy Corbyn, they are not out to wreak hate. They are not denying people's existence.
It's still divisive. I mean, Brexit is one of the most divisive issues we've had in decades.
If you say, OK, what about X, Y, and Z, you're ignoring the issue of why someone like Nigel Farage had milkshake thrown on him. It's no good just saying, well, what about X? What about Y? What about Anna Soubry? You have to engage with the very reasons that Nigel Farage had milkshake thrown on him.
Where does it leave free speech, though? I mean, as awful as some of these views are, and many people don't agree with them, why is it OK to engage in this form of political disagreement using eggs and flour and milkshakes for some politicians and not others? What do you think?
What's happening here is we're saying that Nigel Farage is a bad person and his ideologies are wrong.
Brendan Cox, the widower of the murdered MP Joe Cox, says milkshaking normalises violence. What do we think of that?
I think drawing parallels between milkshaking and genuine political violence is mad, and I think it's disrespectful to those who have suffered and do suffer from genuine political violence. I think this is an attempt to fight back by people who perhaps don't necessarily have the will, which is a shame, or the means, which is not a shame, to participate in the kind of debate that we're having now. And you know, for some people, they don't want to hear whether or they don't want to hear the kind of debates that they believe are being stirred up. They, I think, very often feel that politicians act in bad faith and make arguments in bad faith and are not actually looking to participate in some kind of battle of ideas, some kind of marketplace of ideas. That actually it's all for show, and if that is for show, well, so's this.
But what about?
But then you have to remember that the people that harassed Anna Soubry feel just as passionately that their views are being silenced and ignored. They regard Anna Soubry's ideals on Brexit as so antithetical to theirs that they feel somehow warranted at misbehaving in the way that they did. And it just seems to me that when you have a polarized political environment, we have to understand that the passions and the emotions that one side feels is more than matched by the other. And just as one side feels silenced or disempowered, so do members of the other side. And I just think there's a kind of blindness that we've kind of built into our politics, where we simply like the empathy.
But Anna Soubry, as a politician, is someone who is very pro-Remain, wants to stop Brexit. That is entirely different from someone who is questioning people's right to be in this country because of the colour of their skin.
Well, Farage actually doesn't question people's right to be in this country because of the colour of his skin. Some of his supporters might.
I mean, some of the UKIP.
But you have to remember that Farage has got the support of millions and millions of people. And if you're just going to dismiss them and say somehow these people are beyond the pale, then basically what we're calling for is a kind of soft, gentle civil war where anything can be done in relation to them because they're the other that somehow we find distasteful. And I think when we walk down that road, we are facing a very major political crisis that will be unresolvable in the immediate or medium term.
What do you think about that?
I think defending Nigel Farage by saying he has the backing of millions and millions of people is playing into his rhetoric. I think you're doing a disservice to those people who voted Brexit and yet find Farage detestable.
Political acts like throwing milkshakes, throwing eggs, is the start of a slippery slope that actually starts to undermine democracy. What do you say to that?
Well, unfortunately, with slippery slope arguments, they were never arguments against doing the first act in the first place. As I said, I'm not sure if this is undermining democracy. I don't know if throwing eggs in milkshakes can damage democratic institutions.
It's not the first time this form of protest has been used, is it? I mean, I remember Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott having the egg thrown at him, and then he chucked a couple of punches and became known as Two Jabs Prescott. Prime Minister Harold Wilson had an egg thrown at him back in 1970. I'm sure that you guys know many, many more examples of that. So is this a peculiar British thing? Is this how we like to show our distaste for certain politics?
So when it first started out, I guess it became like a viral trend. You know, you had your videos out there, you had your photos out there, and again, it was bringing shame on those politicians on social media and in a viral kind of scope, I guess.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it does show you the power of copycat motives when you're dealing with political violence. So, okay, one person throws a milkshake, it goes viral, more people throw milkshakes. I don't think that's going to lead to genuine political violence. However, if social media fuels the rise of genuine political violence, I would also expect retribution and copycats in that respect as well.
And in fact, talking about social media, it has led to a lot of memes doing the rounds, like lactose against intolerance and milkshakes against racism. I suppose, particularly for young people, it's a quite a form of protest which appeals to them. It's easy to do, it's easy to understand, it's easy to put onto social media.
For sure, the revolution will be pasteurized. I think it's absolutely a reflection of a politics that is changing, and there is no doubt that the internet has revolutionized what it means to participate politically, often for good, very often for bad as well. And I think this is perhaps something that we're going to have to come to terms with. If people don't feel that they can go out, like Frank calls for, and have these discussions, have these debates, feel that they are participating politically, participating democratically, then something needs to change. And I think that will require either a change in the way we do our politics or in the way we do our democracy.
I mean, one thing I wanted to
see,
ask
there's an honourable tradition in England of heckling, which is part of our democracy, which is really positive. And I think even throwing eggs or milkshaking in the right kind of context can be legitimate if it's done in a particular context, if it's something that, in a sense, expresses a reaction to what's going on. I remember myself as a student activist in the 1960s, 70s, we all threw eggs at people we didn't like. It wasn't the most mature behavior on our part, but it represented a certain reaction to a specific kind of context. Whereas today, I think it seems to me it's much more about creating a border between some kind of people and other kind of people. And it's much more about closing down discussion. And I think that's what I'm really worried about. It's not the eggs or the milkshake, but the signal that somehow debate must stop on these issues, that some people are not allowed to have a voice. I think that's really my main concern in the 21st century.
When you threw eggs back in the past, Frank, at people or views that you didn't like, was it productive? What was the end result?
I think it was performative, and certainly it brought us together. The people that were student radicals felt that they bonded as a result of these experiences. I'm not really sure it was productive. To some extent, it expressed our frustration and our inability to be able to express our views in a more sophisticated, more powerful way. But I think it's an understandable reaction. It's not something, it wasn't my finest moment in my life, but it's something that, I'm quite happy to live with even now.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's probably pretty cathartic to take part in a demonstration like that.
Well, perhaps. I think when you're talking about the legitimacy of these actions and when you're talking about throwing eggs, I think what Frank is doing, and I think what is a useful distinction to make, is perhaps you can divide between the legitimacy of the act and the justification you have for the act. I don't know how these could ever in themselves be legitimate acts, but certainly you could find some justification, perhaps. They appeal to some end or they try to achieve something. In Frank's case, it was to make his student cohort feel closer together. In this case, it seems to be to shut down a certain sort of debate around these issues that some of these figures are talking about. But of course, as the ends recede into the future, the efficacy of these acts
if you look at, like, for example, if you look at one of the acts, there was that Muslim young man, who threw a milkshake at Tommy Robinson. That was a reaction to Tommy Robinson and his gang of people just surrounding him and then getting closer and closer to him, and he was just holding a milkshake and reacted and threw his milkshake at him.
And in any of these cases, is it ever seen as an actual assault? Do people get arrested for throwing milkshakes on these politicians, or is it seen as part of the cause?
I mean, it's not a violent act, really, is it?
Well,
They are
technically it's an
under the law.
assault.
I mean, but that's a distinct question from whether they are ethically right to do or whether they're violent.
Because the reaction to Nigel Farage, for example, particularly in the media, was very much one of general mirth and hilarity.
Yeah, and I don't think these are violence. I don't think you can argue that these are violent acts. But certainly,
well, let's say someone throws a milkshake and it catches him in the eye and he's temporarily blinded.
Okay,
I mean, how far?
We can discuss that. But the point is that it is an assault, and it shouldn't just be treated lightly and with general mirth.
Right.
It is still a serious undertaking.
But do you think it is treated lightly?
Yes, in some quarters it is.
Yeah, and is that a problem?
If it leads to the general dumbing down of discourse, I think it does. But, as you can see, we are having a debate, and there is a healthy debate online, and there's a healthy debate in the media about whether this is acceptable. So in some quarters it is treated with general mirth, but there is a debate. There's no shutting down a debate here.
I mean, you would say that this milkshaking has completely failed. Nigel Farage is on Question Time what feels like every day of the week.
This is what
he has a huge media platform. Tommy Robinson still has a huge digital media platform. They are more than capable of participating in their debate. Some would even go as far as to say that this kind of quote-unquote political protest or even political violence is just drawing attention to these causes.
Is that what you see on social media? I mean, is there a sort of is there a split between people who thought it was a great thing to do and those who say this should never happen? Because
Jeremy Corbyn was egged earlier this year. You know, you mentioned a press cut. Obviously, there are two sides who never agree on this, and of course, Frank is right. There is a split, a polarised society who are not looking to engage with one another. But whether or not they're throwing eggs or milkshakes on another, I don't think that's changing anything. Perhaps it's a symbol of it, but ultimately, it hasn't changed the ability of these politicians to get their message out. They are still free to say what they want. They are still free to participate in our democracy. OK, they're covered in, dairy products from time to time, but that does not affect their ability to participate in our political discourse, and that is why this is not political violence.
So more
there's one context that we should bear in mind. If you remember the Prescott incident, where he had an egg thrown at him, and then he landed a couple of punches on the person that assaulted him, I think that tells us that there is a dangerous mix here, because not everybody is going to passively walk away when they have a milkshake thrown in their faces and their brand new suit being destroyed. I think you are creating potentially a kind of a dynamic which, if unleashed, does lead to violence and physical fights. And we do have to ask the question, is that something that we're quite indifferent about? Or do we just see the milkshake throwing as a singular act, not what happens afterwards or what may potentially happen afterwards? I know myself, if somebody throws a milkshake at me, I could see myself not being able to restrain or control myself because
let me ask. I mean, Sharon, you've had an egg thrown at you. Have you wanted to reciprocate and throw eggs at other people whose views you don't share?
I mean, I would happily throw a milkshake at Nigel Farage, if that's what you're asking, happily. Because essentially what it comes down to...
You don't think it's a waste of a good milkshake, though?
Yeah, well, if you get a cheap milkshake, it's fine. But what I find is these people that are being milkshaked and egged, especially Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson, the rhetoric that they're peddling is causing violent acts.
But Alex is saying that, that they're still on these shows.
They are. They still have all the media attention. So when they are milkshaked, it is essentially us saying it's shameful. What you're doing and saying is shameful. But they still have media platforms. They still have free speech.
So at the end of the day, what does everyone think? Is it political theatre or is it political violence? Frank?
Well, I think it's essentially performative political theatre. But its danger does not lie in the realm of violence, but in the silencing of discussion and debate. And I do think there's a danger of reinforcing our very polarized political landscape.
Alexander?
There was a point which Gandhi made about non-violence, in which he said that even if our intentions were amiss, and even if we didn't really know what we were doing and our actions were failing us, everyone was still left in the same place to start again. So I can't see how you can call this violence.
OK, Sharon.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I would not call this violence at all. It's just it's a protest. It's a protest against all the negative things that are being peddled in our
And you
media.
don't think that it could lead to violence? We start with a milkshake.
I mean,
we
anything
progress.
could lead to anything at some point. You know, you can't make those kind of assumptions that something's going to happen. But like, from what I can see, it's just political protest.
And justified.
Yeah, 100%.
And Alex?
I think this is an awkward piece of political protest that has not worked very well. And I think the idea that having milkshakes thrown at you has somehow excluded you from the debate is clearly nonsense.
Guys, thank you very much indeed for joining this roundtable discussion. It's good to have all of you. Thank you very much indeed. And remember, you can see more of this debate and the discussion. It'll be on YouTube. Just search for TRT World Roundtable. You can also follow us on Twitter. But for now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. See you next time.